In today's world, you can order pizza, call an ambulance, or hail a taxi. In the 1800s on the North American frontier, none of that existed. No roads, no pharmacies, no hospitals, no neighbors for miles. Just endless wilderness. Winter in the West wasn't just cold, it was a death sentence. At minus 40 degrees with 4 meters of snow, you might not find your home. Freezing to death was the easiest way to die. Freezing meant that your life was completely over. No exceptions. The primitive instincts that humans once had have been lost over the centuries. Forgotten knowledge could save you in a situation where there is nothing. But we have forgotten it. In the 1800s, people knew these skills. They used them, they relied on them, and without them, they died. Today we're going to talk about forgotten shelters. I will tell you about 7 forgotten survival shelters that could save your life in the wild. Watch this video to the end and you will learn how a single log could become your home and a simple hole could save you from the cold. On the endless plains of the Great Plains, where there were no trees or stones, settlers faced the problem of building homes. The only material available was sod, a dense layer of earth interwoven with grass roots. They used it to build sod houses. These were not just earthen huts, but real engineering structures. The walls were laid out in rectangular blocks of sod, which were stacked in layers like bricks. The thick sod walls had enormous thermal mass. In winter, they slowly absorbed heat from the hearth, and at night slowly released it back, maintaining a stable temperature. In summer, on the contrary, the turf kept the interior cool. The inner side of the walls could be covered with clay or lime to prevent the earth from crumbling. The roof was usually made of wooden beams covered with a layer of the same turf. This provided reliable protection from wind and cold. Building a sod house was a laborious but effective process. First, a suitable plot of land with dense turf was selected. Then, using a plow, rectangular blocks of turf measuring approximately 18 by 24 inches and about 4 to 6 inches thick were cut. These blocks, intertwined with grass roots, were very strong and resembled bricks. The foundation was made from the same sod, laid in several layers. The walls were erected by stacking the blocks on top of each other, like stone masonry. To make the walls strong and wind-resistant, they were made very thick, up to 3 feet, about 90 centimeters. The windows and doors were made of wood and inserted into the walls. The roof was the most complex element. It was made of wooden beams laid on top of the walls. Thin branches, straw, and finally a layer of turf were laid on top of the beams. The sod roof was very heavy, so the beams had to be very strong. To protect against rain, sod could be laid on top of the roof so that the grass grew outward. This helped to drain rainwater. The sod house was a very practical dwelling. It was warm in winter and cool in summer, which was very important in the harsh climate of the prairies. The sod walls were an excellent insulator, and the house was very quiet. However, sod houses also had their drawbacks. The interior walls, which were not covered with clay or lime, could crumble, and soil could fall from the ceiling. In rainy weather, the roof could leak and had to be repaired constantly. The inside of a sod house was dark because the windows were small to prevent heat loss. In addition, the sod could attract vermin such as snakes, mice, and insects. This was a serious problem that had to be solved. Sod houses were a temporary solution. As soon as the settlers had settled the land, they built more durable houses out of wood or stone. But sod houses played a huge role in the settlement of the prairies. They enabled people to survive in harsh conditions until they were able to build more durable dwellings. Today, sod houses are a symbol of the endurance and ingenuity of the first settlers. They show how people can use natural resources to survive, even when they are very scarce. What one modern thing would you trade for the right to live in such a house, knowing all its features? Tell us in the comments. Settlers who ventured into areas where trees were rare often built semi-dugouts. These were shelters that were partially dug into the slope of a hill or ravine. The walls and floor were made of earth, and the front part and roof were built of wood or logs. The earth, like turf, served as an excellent heat insulator and had enormous thermal mass. Most of the dwelling was below ground level, which protected it from cold winds and severe frosts. Inside such a shelter, it was much warmer than in a regular log cabin. What did they do when they couldn't find a suitable slope for a semi-dugout? Then they had to build their shelters in open areas, using other, more primitive methods. The principle of the semi-dugout was based on the use of the Earth's thermal inertia. The Earth heats up slowly and cools down slowly. Thanks to this, the semi-dugout remained warm in winter and cool in summer. This allowed people to survive in conditions where the temperature difference between day and night was very large. To build a semi-dugout, a pit was first dug. The walls and floor were left earthen, and the front part was made of logs. The roof was gabled so that water could run off it. It consisted of wooden beams covered with branches and a layer of earth or turf on top. The interior walls were coated with clay, which not only made them smoother, but also protected them from crumbling. In the center of the dwelling was a hearth, the smoke from which escaped through an opening in the roof. The semi-dugout was a very practical and warm dwelling. It protected against strong winds and frost, which was very important in the prairie conditions. In addition, it was relatively easy to build and did not require expensive materials. However, dugouts had their drawbacks. It was very dark inside because there were few windows. Another problem was dampness. Groundwater could seep into the room, and in rainy weather, the roof could leak. This led to mold and unpleasant odors. Semi-dugouts were temporary dwellings. As soon as the settlers had cultivated the land and gained access to other materials, they built more durable houses. But semi-dugouts played a huge role in the settlement of new lands. They enabled people to survive the first, most difficult winters until it became possible to build more comfortable dwellings. Today, semi-dugouts are a symbol of ingenuity and endurance. Nowadays, when technology allows us to build comfortable and warm houses from a wide variety of materials, we often forget that survival once depended on how we use the resources around us. Without modern tools, our ancestors built houses that allowed them to survive the harshest winters. But what if they didn't even have land or wood? What if the only material available was stone, and there wasn't a single tree in sight? Stay with us to find out the answers to these questions. In mountainous areas where there were no forest but plenty of stones, people built stone huts. These were primitive but sturdy structures. The walls were made of stones without mortar, and the gaps between them were filled with mud and clay. The thick stone walls served as an excellent barrier against wind and cold. They also had thermal mass. When heated by the hearth, they slowly released heat throughout the night. The roof was usually made of wood and covered with a layer of earth for extra insulation. Such huts were virtually impenetrable to wild animals and provided reliable protection from the weather. How did they build these huts if they had no tools? They used their hands and knowledge. Building stone huts required enormous physical effort and a deep understanding of the properties of stone. People gathered stones of various sizes and shapes and stacked them to form walls. To ensure that the structure was stable, they selected stones that fit tightly together. Large flat stones served as the foundation, while smaller ones were used to fill in the gaps. The most difficult part was building the corners. To make the corners strong, people selected stones of a special shape and laid them in an overlapping pattern. This was a kind of precursor to modern bricklaying. Dirt and clay were used as mortar. They were mixed with straw or grass to make the mixture stronger and more viscous. This mixture filled the gaps between the stones, preventing cold air from entering. The roof was the most vulnerable part of a stone hut. It was made of wood and covered with a layer of earth. Like the walls, the earthen roof had thermal mass. It kept the heat in during winter and the coolness in during summer. But it had one significant drawback. It was very heavy. Therefore, the beams that supported the roof had to be very strong. To protect against rain, turf could be laid on top of the roof so that the grass grew outward. This helped drain rainwater and prevented the roof from leaking. Stone huts were very practical and reliable dwellings. They provided protection from strong winds and frost, which was very important in mountainous areas. In addition, they were very durable and could last for decades. However, stone huts also had their drawbacks. It was very dark inside because there were few windows. Another problem was dampness. Stone cooled quickly, and combined with high humidity, this created uncomfortable living conditions. In addition, building a stone hut required enormous effort and time. In the center of the stone hut was a hearth. It was not only a source of heat, but also a place for cooking. The smoke from it escaped through a hole in the roof, which created problems with smoke. However, the heat from the hearth warmed the thick stone walls, which then gave it back to the room. Thus, the stone hut was not just a place to sleep, but a real shelter. Its design and location were thought out down to the smallest detail to give people the opportunity to survive in harsh conditions. It was a testament to the ingenuity and endurance of our ancestors. In forested areas where logs were abundant, people built log huts. These were simple but effective structures. The logs were stacked on top of each other, and the gaps between them were filled with moss or clay. The main advantage of a log cabin was its thermal insulation. Wood is a poor conductor of heat, so it kept the heat inside and the cold outside. Inside the hut, there was always a hearth that provided heat. But what if the fire went out and the temperature dropped below zero? The hearth was built of stones that accumulated heat and then slowly released it throughout the night. This way, even when the fire in the hearth went out, the hut remained warm. The construction of a log cabin began with the selection of suitable logs. They were trimmed so that they fit tightly together. The corners were made using locks or bowl cuts. This was a way to connect the logs without nails, which made the structure strong and wind-resistant. The gaps between the logs were filled with moss, clay, or a mixture of clay and straw. This was very important for insulation, as cold air could penetrate through the gaps. A layer of clay was applied to the walls to protect the wood from moisture. The roof was gabled so that water could run off it. It consisted of wooden beams on which boards or turf were laid. Sometimes the roof was covered with shingles, thin wooden plates that provided good protection from rain. The hearth was the center of life in a log cabin. It was built of stones which had high thermal mass. This meant that the stones heated up slowly, but also cooled slowly. When the fire went out, the stones continued to give off heat throughout the night, keeping the cabin warm. The smoke from the hearth escaped through an opening in the roof, which caused problems with smoke. There was always a little smoke inside the hut, which was not only annoying but also served as a kind of preservative for the wood, protecting it from rotting. A log cabin was a very warm and sturdy dwelling. It provided good protection from the cold and wind, which was very important in forest areas. In addition, it was relatively easy to build and did not require expensive materials. However, log cabins also had their drawbacks. It was very dark inside because there were few windows. Another problem was the risk of fire. A wooden house could burn down in a matter of minutes, so you always had to be on your guard. Log cabins were temporary dwellings, but their design was so effective that they were used for many centuries. They were a symbol of ingenuity and endurance. Imagine that you live in a tribe that is constantly on the move. Your home must not only be warm and secure, but also light enough to take with you. What would your ideal design be? Stay with us to find out how the settlers solved this problem. Wigwams were the traditional dwellings of many indigenous tribes, but their design was so effective that settlers adopted some of the ideas. A wigwam was cone-shaped and built from wooden poles covered with animal skins or mats. In the center of the wigwam was a hearth, and at the top was an opening for smoke to escape. Warm air from the hearth rose upward, and cold air sank downward, creating constant circulation. The wigwam was easy to assemble and disassemble, making it ideal for a nomadic lifestyle. The wigwam, or teepee, as it is also called, was a true engineering marvel. It was based on long wooden poles that were tied together at the top to form a conical frame. Buffalo hides sewn together or reed mats were stretched over the frame. This covering was very dense and provided good protection from wind and precipitation. The opening at the top of the wigwam, called a smoke hole, was not just a hole, but part of a complex ventilation system. Warm air from the hearth in the center rose upward and exited through the smoke hole. This created a vacuum that drew cold air from below. This cold air, in turn, was heated by the hearth and rose upward. In this way, a constant air circulation was created in the wigwam, which prevented it from becoming stagnant and provided warmth. The main advantage of the wigwam was its mobility. The tribes that lived on the Great Plains were constantly on the move in search of bison. The wigwam was the ideal dwelling for this way of life. It could be dismantled in a matter of minutes, and the poles and skins could be transported on horses. This allowed the tribes to quickly change location without wasting time building new dwellings. The wigwam was also very adaptable. Its design could be easily changed depending on the weather. In hot weather, for example, the skins could be raised to create a breeze. In cold weather, the skins were lowered and the gaps between them were filled with grass or moss to keep out the cold. The wigwam was not just a dwelling, but a symbol of culture and tradition. Every part of the wigwam had its own meaning. The poles symbolized the family, and the skins symbolized protection. The hearth was the center of life, and the smoke hole was the connection to the sky. Rituals, meetings, and celebrations were held inside the wigwam. Settlers who encountered the harsh climate of the Great Plains quickly realized that their traditional homes were not suitable for these conditions. They adopted some ideas from the indigenous tribes and began to build similar dwellings. This was proof that in order to survive, one must be flexible and learn from those who know how to live in these conditions. Thus, the wigwam was not just a dwelling, but a true work of engineering. Its design and mobility were ideal for a nomadic lifestyle, and its symbolism reflected the culture and traditions of the tribes that lived on the Great Plains. Pit houses were another type of shelter used on the frontier. They were pits dug into the ground and covered with canvas or animal skins. The pit provided protection from the wind, and the earth provided insulation. Pit houses were very simple to build, but provided reliable protection from the cold and wind. A small fire was lit inside the pit to provide heat. Smoke escaped through an opening in the roof, which allowed air to circulate. Pit houses were the perfect shelter for those who found themselves in the wilderness without tools or materials. Pit houses, or earth shelters as they were also called, were an ingenious solution for survival in harsh conditions. Their main advantage was geothermal stability. The earth at depth has a constant temperature that does not depend on weather conditions. Taking advantage of this feature, settlers could create shelters that were relatively warm in winter and cool in summer. To build a pit house, a location without groundwater was chosen. Then a pit about 3 to 4 feet, approximately 1 meter, deep and 6 to 8 feet wide was dug. The walls and floor of the pit were left earthen, which provided additional insulation. The roof was made of wooden poles laid across the top of the pit and covered with a layer of earth, then tarpaulin or animal skins. An opening was left at the top for smoke to escape. Despite their simplicity and effectiveness, pit houses had their problems. The most important one was water. In rainy weather, water could accumulate in the pit, turning the shelter into a dirty puddle. To avoid this, the settlers made small channels that drained water away from the pit house. Sometimes they dug drainage pits next to the shelter so that the water would flow there. Another problem was ventilation. Although the opening in the roof provided air circulation, smoke from the fire could sometimes accumulate inside, which was very dangerous. To solve this problem, settlers made small holes in the walls to provide additional fresh air. Pit houses were temporary dwellings, but they played a huge role in the settlement of new lands. They gave people the opportunity to survive the first, most difficult winters until it became possible to build more comfortable homes. Today, the pit house is a symbol of ingenuity and endurance. Nowadays, when technology allows us to build comfortable and warm homes from a wide variety of materials, we often forget that survival once depended on how we use the resources around us. Without modern tools, our ancestors built homes that allowed them to survive the harshest winters. But what if they didn't even have land and there wasn't a single tree around? What if they had to seek shelter in the most unexpected places? Stay with us to find out how settlers solved this problem. Ravines, or gullies, were often used as natural shelters. People built their dwellings on the slopes of ravines, using the natural protection from wind and cold. The walls and floor were made of earth, and the front and roof were built of wood or logs. The ravine also provided invisibility, which was critical in conditions where danger could come from hostile tribes or wild animals. A ravine shelter was very reliable, but it had one drawback. It was easy to flood during rain or snowmelt. Using ravines as shelters was a brilliant solution. The ravine was a natural depression in the ground, which immediately provided two key advantages: protection from the wind and concealment. The slopes of the ravine acted as shields, blocking cold air currents, and the depression itself made the dwelling virtually invisible to outsiders. To build such a shelter, the settlers dug a niche in the slope of the ravine. The walls and floor were left earthen, which provided excellent thermal insulation. The front part, which faced the ravine, was built of wood or logs. The roof was gabled to allow water to drain off and was covered with a layer of earth or turf, which provided additional insulation and camouflage. In the center of the shelter, a small fire was lit, the smoke from which escaped through a hole in the roof. The hearth, as in other dwellings, was the center of life, a source of heat and a place for cooking. The biggest problem with ravine shelters was water. In rainy weather or in spring, when the snow melted, water could accumulate at the bottom of the ravine and flood the dwelling. To avoid this, the settlers dug small drainage channels to divert water away from the entrance. Sometimes they dug special pits to collect water, which could then be used for domestic purposes. Another problem was ventilation. In an enclosed space, smoke from the fire could accumulate, which was very dangerous. To solve this problem, settlers made small holes in the walls to provide additional fresh air. Invisibility was critically important in the Wild West. Hostile tribes, bandits, or wild animals could attack at any moment. A shelter in a ravine was virtually invisible from a distance, giving its inhabitants an advantage. In addition, ravines were often rich in resources. Bushes and trees could grow there, providing fuel for fires. They could also contain water sources, which was essential for survival. Thus, a ravine shelter was not just a place to spend the night, but a full-fledged dwelling that gave people the opportunity to survive in harsh conditions. Nowadays, when technology allows us to build comfortable and warm houses from a wide variety of materials, we often forget that survival once depended on how we use the resources around us. Without modern tools, our ancestors built houses that allowed them to survive the harshest winters. We live in a world where comfort and safety have become the norm. We are used to our lives being protected by technology. But these people, who lived on the frontier in the 19th century, survived not because of technology, but because of their wits and experience. They knew how to build a shelter out of sod, how to make a wigwam, how to dig a pit house. They knew that to survive, you had to be prepared for any situation. You may never need these skills, but if you find yourself in the wilderness and technology fails you, you will remember this episode. Now, write in the comments what other topics related to survival in the Wild West you are interested in. Would you like to learn how settlers found water in the arid prairies, how they hunted game without modern guns, or how they treated wounds far from civilization? Share your ideas. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes.